Good evening. Tonight we examine something that once graced the tables of popes and presidents, of factory workers and fashionable ladies. A dark, bitter elixir that promised vigor and vitality in equal measure. COCA wine, a blend of Andean leaf and European grape that briefly ruled the shelves of pharmacies and parlors before vanishing into the footnotes of pharmaceutical history. Forget your modern energy drinks and your carefully measured supplements. This was medicine mixed with pleasure, respectability laced with addiction. A moment when the line between tonic and intoxicant was drawn not in laboratories, but in legislative chambers and newspaper columns. Take a second to like and subscribe if this is the kind of content you enjoy. And in the comments, share your location and the time where you are. I love seeing how far and wide our community reaches. Silence your notifications, pour yourself something mild, and let's begin. The story begins not in a pharmacy but on a mountainside, where thin air makes breathing a negotiation, and where a plant with small green leaves grew in terraced fields that climbed toward clouds. The coca plant, Erythroxylum coca, had been cultivated in the Andes for millennia before any European physician thought to extract its secrets. In the kingdoms of the Inca and the civilizations that preceded them, the leaf was neither exotic nor dangerous. It was practical, a tool for endurance in a landscape that demanded it. Archaeological evidence, patient and unspectacular, tells us that coca use extends back at least 8,000 years. Lime containers and leaf bundles in burial sites, residues on ceramic vessels, mummified bodies with coca quids still pressed between teeth and cheek. These were not ceremonial oddities, but the material traces of everyday practice. The leaf was chewed, held in the mouth with a small amount of alkaline substance, lime from burned shells or ash from certain plants, that released the alkaloids slowly into the bloodstream. The effect was mild by the standards of later pharmaceutical extracts, a numbing of the mouth, a suppression of hunger and fatigue, a clarity that made the long work of terrace farming or the thin air march of imperial messengers endurable. The Inca state, that vast administrative apparatus that stitched together mountain and coast through roads and quipu records, controlled coca production with the attention it gave to other strategic resources. Certain valleys, the Yungas of Bolivia, the warm eastern slopes of the Andes, were designated for cultivation. The leaf was distributed as a ration to laborers, to soldiers, to the relay runners who carried messages across impossible distances. It was also a sacred plant, used in ritual offerings to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, and in ceremonies that marked transitions and petitions. But sacredness did not preclude utility. The Inca understood both dimensions without conflict. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they encountered coca with the incomprehension of men whose own pharmacology revolved around wine and prayer. Chroniclers like Pedro Chiesa de Leon and Bernabé Cobo recorded what they saw with varying degrees of curiosity and distaste. Some Spaniards condemned the leaf as a tool of indigenous superstition and sought to suppress it. Others, more pragmatic and greedy, realized that coca-chewing laborers worked longer in the mines and required less food. The silver mines of Potosi, that engine of Spanish colonial wealth, consumed indigenous lives with a terrible efficiency, and coca became part of the system that made that extraction possible. The plant was sold in markets, taxed by colonial authorities, and integrated into the forced labor regime called the mita. The botanical knowledge of coca traveled slowly into European awareness. Spanish priests and physicians wrote accounts, but the leaf itself did not travel well. Dried coca loses potency during the long Atlantic voyage, and early attempts to introduce Europeans to its effects through imported leaves mostly failed. Coca remained for centuries a colonial commodity, important in South America but peripheral to European medicine and commerce. The transformation of coca from an Andean chewing leaf into a European pharmaceutical commodity required the intervention of 19th century chemistry that confident science of separation and purification that believed the world could be understood molecule by molecule. The key figure, inevitably, was a German chemist working in the laboratories that would reshape global pharmacology. Albert Niemann, a doctoral student at the University of Göttingen, published in 1860 his dissertation on the isolation of the active principle of coca leaves. He called it cocaine, a name built from the plant's genus and the chemical suffix that marked it as an alkaloid. Niemann's process was meticulous. Maceration of dried leaves, treatment with solvents, crystallization, purification. What emerged was a white crystalline powder that bore little resemblance to the green leaves from which it came, but carried the plant's effects concentrated to a degree no traditional preparation had ever approached. The work itself took place in laboratories that smelled of ether and acid, where glassware clinked against marble benches, and where patience was measured in days of careful observation. Niemann started with dried coca leaves imported from Peru, material that had already lost some potency during the Atlantic crossing, but retained enough alkaloid content for extraction. He ground the leaves into powder, treated them with dilute sulfuric acid to convert the alkaloids into water-soluble salts, then filtered the mixture to remove plant debris. The filtrate was then made alkaline with sodium carbonate, which caused the cocaine base to precipitate out of solution. This precipitate was dissolved in ether, filtered again, and allowed to crystallize slowly as the ether evaporated. The process required multiple iterations to achieve purity, each cycle removing more of the contaminating substances until what remained was the nearly pure alkaloid. The white crystals that resulted were bitter to the taste and produced, when placed on the tongue, a distinctive numbing sensation. Niemann noted this in his dissertation, observing that cocaine produced local anesthesia, though he did not immediately grasp the full implications of this property. His work earned him a doctorate, but he would not live to see the revolution it sparked. Niemann died in 1861, just a year after his dissertation was published, victim to what some sources suggest was laboratory exposure to toxic chemicals. His brief career left a legacy that would reshape medicine and create social consequences he could never have imagined. Niemann's achievement opened a door. If the active principle could be isolated, it could be measured, studied, standardized, and marketed. Other chemists followed his lead, refining his techniques and exploring variations. Wilhelm Lossen, working in Germany in the 1860s, improved the extraction process and conducted some of the earliest pharmacological studies of pure cocaine. In Austria, researchers began experimenting with different solvents and purification methods, seeking higher yields and greater purity. By the 1860s and 1870s, pharmaceutical houses in Germany, France, and later the United States were producing cocaine for medical use. Merck, the German chemical firm based in Darmstadt, became one of the major suppliers, manufacturing the alkaloid in quantities that dwarfed traditional coca consumption. The company's laboratories, equipped with the latest in chemical apparatus, could process shipments of coca leaves into refined cocaine with an efficiency that made the product commercially viable. Merck sold cocaine to hospitals, to research institutions, and to other pharmaceutical companies that incorporated it into their own preparations. The scale of production increased steadily through the 1870s and 1880s. What had begun as laboratory curiosity became industrial manufacture. Factories in Germany processed tons of coca leaves annually, producing kilograms of pure cocaine hydrochloride that was then shipped across Europe and to the Americas. The logistics required coordination between importers who brought coca from South America, chemists who managed the extraction, and distributors who sold the finished product to medical professionals and pharmacies. The pure substance allowed physicians to experiment with doses, to inject it, to apply it topically, to measure effects in ways that crude botanical preparations never permitted. Early medical journals from the period contained detailed accounts of experimentation. Doctors tested cocaine on themselves first. A common practice in 19th century pharmacology, noting the physiological responses with the careful empiricism of men who understood they were working with powerful unknowns. Heart rate increased, pupils dilated, fatigue seemed to vanish, mood elevated. These were not subtle effects, and they suggested therapeutic potential across a range of conditions. The medical community seized on cocaine with an enthusiasm that seems, in retrospect, both earnest and reckless. The 1880s were the decade of cocaine's medical ascendancy, when it seemed that the substance might revolutionize therapeutics. In 1884, Karl Koller, an Austrian ophthalmologist working in Vienna, demonstrated cocaine's use as a topical anesthetic for eye surgery. The discovery came almost by accident. Koller had been searching for a local anesthetic that could replace the crude methods then available for eye operations, procedures that required physical restraint of conscious patients or risky general anesthesia. He learned of cocaine's numbing properties, possibly from conversations with Sigmund Freud, and decided to test whether it could anesthetize the cornea. The experiment was simple and decisive. Koller placed a drop of cocaine solution onto a frog's eye, waited a few moments, then touched the cornea with a probe. The frog did not react. He repeated the experiment on a rabbit, then on a dog, with the same results. Finally, he and a colleague tested it on each other, instilling cocaine solution into their own eyes and confirming that the cornea became completely insensitive to touch while other sensations remained intact. Koller presented his findings to the Heidelberg Ophthalmological Society in September 1884, and the news spread rapidly through the medical world. Within months, surgeons across Europe and America were using cocaine for eye surgery, and researchers were exploring its application to other surgical procedures. The impact was immediate and profound. Operations that had been nearly impossible due to patient movement and pain could now be performed with precision and relative comfort. Cocaine provided anesthesia without the risks of ether or chloroform, without the need for elaborate apparatus or specialized training. A few drops of solution, a moment's wait, and the surgeon could proceed. It was, by any measure, a genuine medical advance. Sigmund Freud, then a young neurologist in Vienna struggling to establish his career, became an early and passionate advocate of cocaine for entirely different reasons. In 1884, the same year as Koller's discovery, Freud published his essay Über COCA, a lengthy and enthusiastic endorsement of cocaine as a treatment for a wide range of conditions. Freud had obtained a sample of pure cocaine from Merck and had begun experimenting with it on himself, taking small doses and carefully recording the effects. He experienced, as he described it, exhilaration, increased capacity for work, suppression of hunger, and a general sense of well-being. Freud's essay praised the alkaloid as a treatment for depression, for digestive disorders, for asthma, for morphine addiction, and for what he called nervous exhaustion. He recommended it for colleagues, for patients, and for himself. The tone of the essay is striking, combining genuine scientific observation with an almost evangelical enthusiasm. Freud believed he had discovered something transformative, a substance that could alleviate suffering and enhance human capability. He distributed cocaine to friends and family members, wrote prescriptions for patients, and continued his own use. The personal dimension of Freud's advocacy is important. He was not merely a dispassionate researcher, but a user who found in cocaine something he valued deeply. His letters from this period, particularly those to his fiancée Martha Bernays, contain references to cocaine's effects and to his hopes that the substance might bring him professional recognition. He called cocaine his magical substance and seemed genuinely convinced of its therapeutic superiority to existing treatments. But cocaine's medical promise carried shadows that would become visible soon enough. Freud's friend and colleague Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, a physiologist who had become addicted to morphine following a painful thumb amputation, provided the tragic test case. Freud, believing cocaine could cure morphine addiction, prescribed it to Fleischl-Marxo and encouraged him to use it liberally. The results were catastrophic. Fleischl-Marxo did not overcome his morphine dependence. Instead, he added cocaine to his roster of substances, using both in increasing quantities. The cocaine produced paranoia, hallucinations, and psychotic episodes. Fleischl-Marxo's health deteriorated rapidly, his mental state became fragile, and he died in 1891, a broken man whose suffering had been compounded rather than relieved by cocaine. Freud, chastened but not entirely convinced, quietly distanced himself from his earlier enthusiasm. He stopped writing about cocaine, stopped recommending it so freely, and focused his energies on other aspects of his emerging psychoanalytic practice. But the damage to his reputation was real. Medical colleagues criticized him for reckless advocacy, for promoting a substance without adequate understanding of its risks. The medical literature began to fill with reports of addiction, tolerance, and toxic reactions. Physicians documented cases of cocaine-induced psychosis, of cardiovascular collapse, of patients who had become dependent and were unable to stop using the substance despite mounting harms. By the late 1880s, the medical community's initial enthusiasm had curdled into caution and concern. Cocaine was not the benign wonder drug it had seemed. It was powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous. The lesson, learned painfully through clinical experience, was that isolation of an active principle did not guarantee safety, that concentration of effects carried concentration of risks, and that the confident pronouncements of early advocates needed to be tempered by careful long-term observation. It was into this atmosphere of pharmaceutical experimentation and cautious optimism that coca wine entered, not as a medical invention but as a commercial one. The marriage of coca and wine was a natural synthesis for the 19th century, which understood both substances as tonics and which had a long tradition of medicated wines. Wine had been a vehicle for delivering herbs and minerals since antiquity. The Greeks and Romans had fortified wine with various botanicals. Medieval apothecaries had created wine-based cordials and elixirs, and the practice continued uninterrupted into the industrial age. The addition of coca to wine seemed merely an extension of that tradition, a new ingredient added to an ancient formula. The most famous of these preparations, the one that would become synonymous with coca wine itself, was Vin Mariani. Created in 1863 by Angelo Mariani, a Corsican pharmacist working in Paris, Vin Mariani was a blend of Bordeaux wine and coca leaves. Mariani himself was an interesting figure, a man who combined pharmaceutical training with entrepreneurial instinct and a sophisticated understanding of marketing that was ahead of his time. Born in Corsica in 1838, he had trained as a chemist and pharmacist before establishing himself in Paris, where he opened a pharmacy and laboratory in the fashionable Passy district. Mariani's formula was proprietary and closely guarded, protected by trade secret rather than patent, which would have required public disclosure. The basic method, however, was straightforward enough that it could be inferred and imitated, which explains the proliferation of coca wine products in the following decades. Coca leaves, carefully selected from Peruvian suppliers who dealt with Mariani directly, were macerated in wine. The alcohol extracted the cocaine and other alkaloids from the plant material over a period of days or weeks. The mixture was then filtered to remove the spent leaves, and the resulting wine, now infused with coca alkaloids, was sometimes aged further to allow flavors to meld. The choice of wine mattered. Mariani used Bordeaux, specifically red Bordeaux, which provided a robust flavor profile that could support the bitter notes of coca without being overwhelmed. The wine also needed to have sufficient alcohol content to serve as an effective solvent, typically 12 to 14% by volume, and it needed to be of decent quality since Mariani was marketing to an upscale clientele that would notice poor wine. Some later imitators used cheaper wines or even fortified wines, sacrificing quality for profit margin, but Mariani's original formula maintained standards that justified its premium price. According to later analyses conducted when regulators began to scrutinize such products, Vin Mariani contained approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce. This is a modest dose by the standards of later cocaine use, when users might insufflate or inject tens or hundreds of milligrams at once. But it was sufficient to produce noticeable effects when the recommended serving, typically a small wine glass, was consumed. The company's literature suggested 1 or 2 glasses per day, usually taken before meals or in the evening, doses that would deliver roughly 12 to 24 milligrams of cocaine daily. Mariani understood marketing with a sophistication that surpassed his pharmaceutical contemporaries. He did not sell Vin Mariani merely as medicine. He sold it as a lifestyle product, a tonic for the modern age. His advertisements featured testimonials from celebrities, artists, writers, and politicians who praised the drink in language that blurred therapeutic claims with social aspiration. The testimonials were collected in elaborate albums, beautifully printed volumes that Mariani distributed to pharmacists, physicians, and influential individuals. These albums, some of which survive in museum collections, are remarkable artifacts. They contain photographs and lithographs of the famous endorsers, reproductions of their handwritten letters, and carefully composed testimonials that read more like advertising copy than spontaneous praise. Pope Leo XIII reportedly endorsed the product and appeared on promotional materials, a fact that Mariani exploited mercilessly. The Vatican later distanced itself from the endorsement, suggesting it had been misrepresented or exaggerated, but the damage, if one can call it that, was done. The association with papal approval lent Vin Mariani an air of moral legitimacy that protected it from the kinds of criticism that might otherwise have been leveled at an alcoholic beverage containing a powerful stimulant. If the Pope drank it, the implicit logic ran, how dangerous could it be? Thomas Edison, the American inventor whose fame was international by the 1880s, provided a testimonial that Mariani reproduced widely. Edison, known for his marathon work sessions and his reliance on catnaps rather than regular sleep, reportedly appreciated the stimulant properties of the wine. Sarah Bernhardt, the French actress whose celebrity transcended national boundaries, lent her face and name to Mariani's marketing efforts, as did Émile Zola, the novelist Jules Verne, the science fiction writer, and dozens of others. The list reads like a who's who of late 19th century cultural achievement. And while it is impossible to verify how many of these endorsements were genuine versus purchased or exaggerated, the cumulative effect was powerful. The genius of this approach was that it positioned Vin Mariani as both respectable and pleasurable. It was not the rough stimulant of the working classes or the dangerous vice of bohemian excess. It was a refined product for refined people, a tonic that one might take before dinner or offer to guests without embarrassment. The wine provided a familiar, socially acceptable medium. The COCA provided effects that users found agreeable: increased energy, elevated mood, suppressed appetite, a general sense of well-being. The combination created a product that could be consumed in polite society without shame, that could be displayed on the sideboard next to the sherry in the port. Mariani's success was not merely a matter of clever advertising. The product itself delivered on its promises, at least in the short term. Users did experience increased energy and improved mood. The effects were real, pharmacologically verifiable, and subjectively pleasant. This created genuine word-of-mouth endorsement that supplemented the manufactured testimonials. Physicians prescribed it, patients reported benefit, and the cycle of adoption continued. The commercial operation behind Vin Mariani was substantial. Mariani established factories and warehouses, employed chemists and quality control staff, maintained relationships with coca leaf suppliers in Peru, and developed distribution networks that reached across Europe and into the Americas. By the 1880s, Vin Mariani was being exported to the United States, to Russia, to the colonial territories of European empires. Mariani opened offices in London and in New York, appointing agents to manage sales and to cultivate relationships with pharmacists and physicians. The pricing strategy was carefully calibrated. Vin Mariani was not cheap, which reinforced its positioning as a premium product, but it was not so expensive as to be inaccessible to the middle classes. A bottle might cost several times what ordinary wine cost, but less than many imported luxury goods. The packaging reinforced this positioning. Bottles were elegantly labelled, with Mariani's signature and seal prominently displayed, and the labels often included Latin phrases and pharmaceutical terminology that emphasized the product's scientific bona fides. Mariani's success spawned imitators and competitors, as any successful commercial product does. By the 1870s and 1880s, dozens of COCA wine preparations flooded the market in France, Britain, and the United States. Some were legitimate pharmaceutical products sold through pharmacies with dosing instructions and medical endorsements. Others were patent medicines of dubious composition, marketed through mail-order catalogues and newspaper advertisements, with claims that ranged from plausible to fantastical. The names proliferated, each seeking to evoke European sophistication or medical authority. Vin Tonic Mariani, a variant or imitation of the original, Metcalfe's COCA wine, marketed in the United States with testimonials from American physicians. Maltine with COCA wine, which combined coca with malt extract in a wine base. Pemberton's French wine COCA, the Atlanta product that would evolve into Coca-Cola. The market segmented rapidly. High-end products like Vin Mariani occupied pharmacy shelves and respectable households, marketed to educated consumers who could afford quality and who responded to appeals to health and sophistication. Mid-tier products aimed at a broader middle-class market, often using less expensive wine and lower concentrations of coca, compensating for reduced potency with lower prices and more aggressive advertising. At the bottom of the market were cheap imitations, sometimes fraudulent, that might contain little coca or none at all, relying instead on alcohol, sugar, and aggressive flavoring to create a product that could be sold to less discriminating consumers. The patent medicine trade, which flourished in the United States with particular vigor due to minimal regulation and a robust mail-order infrastructure, embraced COCA wine enthusiastically. Manufacturers made sweeping claims about their product's ability to cure neurasthenia, dyspepsia, melancholia, female complaints, consumption, and a host of other conditions. The advertisements appeared in newspapers and magazines, in almanacs distributed by pharmacies, in catalogues that reached rural households far from any pharmacy. The language was designed to alarm and to reassure, to create anxiety about health, and then to offer the product as solution. Some of these products were manufactured by legitimate pharmaceutical companies that also produced other ethical drugs, meaning drugs sold through physicians and pharmacists rather than directly to consumers. Others came from fly-by-night operations that mixed batches in backrooms and moved on before regulators or angry customers could catch up with them. The result was a marketplace of wildly varying quality, where consumers had little ability to distinguish between products that contained what they claimed and those that were adulterated or fraudulent. The commercial landscape of COCA wine was thus a patchwork. High-end products like Vin Mariani occupied one niche, building brand loyalty through quality and marketing. Mass-market products occupied another, competing on price and availability. Patent medicines occupied a third, relying on sensational claims and direct-to-consumer advertising. The regulatory environment was minimal to non-existent. In most jurisdictions, there were no requirements to list ingredients accurately, no testing for purity or potency, no restrictions on claims of efficacy. A manufacturer could blend coca leaves with wine, add flavoring agents and sugars, bottle the mixture, and sell it as a cure for anything from melancholy to tuberculosis. The economics of production favored entry into the market. Coca leaves could be imported relatively cheaply from Peru and Bolivia, where cultivation remained robust despite growing international scrutiny of cocaine. A kilogram of dried coca leaves in the 1880s might cost a few dollars when purchased in bulk, and that kilogram could be used to produce many bottles of coca wine. Wine, especially lower-grade wine suitable for fortification and flavoring, was abundant and cheap, particularly in France, but also available at reasonable cost in other markets. The manufacturing process required no specialized equipment beyond what a competent pharmacist or distiller would already possess. Containers for maceration, filters, bottles, corks, and labeling equipment. Profit margins, particularly for successful brands like Vin Mariani, were substantial. A bottle that cost perhaps 50 cents to produce, including ingredients, packaging, and labor, might retail for several dollars, yielding margins that could support extensive advertising and distribution costs while still generating significant profit. For Mariani himself, the business made him wealthy. He lived comfortably in Paris, maintained a laboratory and factory, and reinvested profits into expanding his product line and his marketing reach. The international dimension of coca wine trade is worth emphasizing. This was not merely a French or European phenomenon. Coca wine circulated globally, following the pathways of European imperial commerce and medical exchange. British colonial physicians encountered it in India and Africa. Russian aristocrats consumed it in St. Petersburg. American physicians prescribed it from New York to San Francisco. The product moved through the same networks that moved quinine and morphine, through pharmacies and hospitals, through mail order and personal import. What exactly happened when someone drank a glass of coca wine? The pharmacology, understood now in ways the 19th century could only glimpse, is instructive and reveals both the genuine effects users experienced and the risks they unknowingly assumed. Cocaine is a powerful stimulant of the central nervous system, an alkaloid that interferes with the normal functioning of neurotransmitters in the brain and throughout the body. It works primarily by blocking the reuptake of three key neurotransmitters: dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Under normal circumstances, these neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic space between neurons, where they bind to receptors and transmit signals, and then they are quickly reabsorbed by the releasing neuron through specialized transporter proteins. This reuptake process is essential for terminating the signal and maintaining proper neurotransmitter balance. Cocaine binds to these transporter proteins and prevents them from reabsorbing the neurotransmitters, causing dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin to accumulate in the synapse. The result is an amplification and prolongation of their effects. Dopamine, concentrated in brain regions associated with pleasure and reward, produces euphoria, a sense of well-being, increased motivation, and heightened alertness when its levels are elevated. Norepinephrine, part of the body's stress response system, increases heart rate and blood pressure, dilates pupils, and produces a state of arousal and readiness. Serotonin affects mood, appetite, and sleep patterns. The combined effect of elevated levels of all three neurotransmitters is what users of cocaine experience as stimulation, a complex constellation of physical and psychological effects that can be intensely pleasurable and highly reinforcing. In the concentrations present in coca wine, where 6 milligrams of cocaine per ounce meant a typical serving of 3 to 4 ounces delivered roughly 18 to 24 milligrams of cocaine, the effects were mild compared to later forms of cocaine use. Snorting pure cocaine might deliver 50 to 100 milligrams or more in a single dose, and injecting it could deliver even higher concentrations directly into the bloodstream. But mild does not mean absent. Even at the doses present in coca wine, users would have experienced noticeable stimulation. The pharmacokinetics, the movement of the drug through the body, mattered significantly. When cocaine is consumed orally in a wine solution, it must pass through the stomach and be absorbed through the intestinal lining before entering the bloodstream. This process takes time, typically 30 to 60 minutes, and it results in a gradual onset of effects rather than the rapid rush associated with insufflation or injection. The peak plasma concentration of cocaine after oral consumption is also lower than with other routes of administration, and the effects tend to be longer lasting but less intense. Alcohol, the other active ingredient in coca wine, is itself a psychoactive substance with its own complex pharmacology. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant that enhances the effects of GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, and reduces neural excitability. It produces sedation, relaxation, disinhibition, and impairment of motor coordination and cognitive function. The effects of alcohol are dose-dependent, with small amounts producing mild relaxation and larger amounts producing intoxication, impairment, and eventually stupor and unconsciousness. The combination of cocaine and alcohol in the same beverage creates a complex and potentially dangerous pharmacological interaction that 19th century users and physicians did not understand. The stimulant effects of cocaine can mask the sedating effects of alcohol, creating a false sense of sobriety. A person who has consumed both substances might feel alert and capable when in fact their motor skills and judgment are impaired by alcohol. This masking effect can lead to continued drinking beyond what would normally be tolerated, increasing the risk of alcohol poisoning. More dangerously, cocaine and alcohol together undergo a chemical reaction in the liver, where they are metabolized into a third compound called cocaethylene. This reaction occurs when cocaine and ethanol are present in the body simultaneously. An enzyme called carboxylesterase catalyzes the transesterification of cocaine in the presence of ethanol, producing cocaethylene. This metabolite is itself psychoactive, structurally similar to cocaine but with a longer half-life, meaning it remains in the body longer than cocaine alone would. Cocaethylene produces effects similar to cocaine: stimulation, euphoria, increased energy, but it is more cardiotoxic, meaning it places greater stress on the heart. The combination of cocaine and alcohol, particularly when consumed regularly over time, significantly increases the risk of cardiovascular complications. Hypertension, arrhythmias, myocardial infarction, and sudden cardiac death. These risks were entirely unknown to 19th century consumers of coca wine, who viewed the beverage as a healthful tonic rather than a potentially dangerous drug combination. For the typical user of Vin Mariani or its competitors, the subjective experience was likely pleasant and, in the short term, benign. Imagine a bourgeois Parisian woman in the 1880s, prescribed coca wine by her physician for neurasthenia and fatigue. She takes a small glass in the late afternoon, sipping it slowly while reading or conversing with visitors. Within half an hour, she notices a subtle lift in mood, a dissipation of the afternoon fatigue that had been plaguing her. Conversation seems easier, her thoughts clearer, the minor irritations of domestic life less oppressive. The effect is mild, not overwhelming, and it fades gradually over 2 or 3 hours, leaving her feeling restored rather than depleted. This experience, repeated daily or several times per week, creates a pattern that can easily become habitual. The ritual of the afternoon glass, the reliable improvement in mood and energy, the pleasant taste of wine with a slight bitterness, all combine to make coca wine an attractive and seemingly harmless part of daily routine. There is no moment of dramatic intoxication, no obvious impairment, nothing that suggests danger or excess. But beneath this pleasant surface, chronic use could lead to tolerance and dependence, physiological adaptations that 19th century medicine understood imperfectly, if at all. Tolerance develops when the brain adapts to the presence of a drug, reducing its response so that higher doses are needed to achieve the same effects. With cocaine, tolerance develops through several mechanisms: downregulation of dopamine receptors, changes in neurotransmitter synthesis, and alterations in the sensitivity of neural circuits. A person who initially experiences a pleasant lift from one glass of coca wine might find, after weeks or months of regular use, that the same dose produces diminished effects. The natural response is to increase the dose, drinking more or drinking more frequently. Dependence, both psychological and physical, can develop with regular use. Psychological dependence is characterized by craving, by a sense that the drug is necessary for normal functioning, by preoccupation with obtaining and using the substance. Physical dependence involves withdrawal symptoms when use is discontinued. Cocaine withdrawal, while not as medically dangerous as alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal, produces uncomfortable symptoms: fatigue, depression, increased appetite, disturbed sleep, and anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure from normally enjoyable activities. Some users of coca wine found themselves drinking more to achieve the same effects, escalating from 1 glass per day to several, from moderate use to heavy use. Others experienced insomnia and irritability, the stimulant effects disrupting sleep patterns and creating a cycle of fatigue and increased use. Still others found that when they tried to stop, perhaps because their physician advised it or because they themselves became concerned about their consumption, they experienced withdrawal symptoms that made abstinence difficult. The fatigue and depression that followed discontinuation could last for days or weeks, tempting them to resume use for relief. The medical profession's understanding of these dynamics was incomplete and often contradictory. Cocaine was known to be habit-forming by the 1890s. This was documented in medical journals and discussed at professional conferences, but the mechanisms of addiction were poorly understood. The prevailing model of addiction emphasized moral weakness and lack of willpower rather than neuropharmacology and brain chemistry. Physicians debated whether coca wine was truly addictive or merely created a psychological dependence, a distinction that seemed meaningful to them but that proved less clear in practice. Some argued that the wine diluted the cocaine to safe levels and that the combination was less dangerous than pure cocaine preparations, which could be injected or insufflated for more intense effects. They pointed to the slow onset and mild effects of oral consumption as evidence of safety, contrasting coca wine with the more problematic uses of cocaine that were beginning to appear in medical literature. Others warned that the pleasant taste and social acceptability of coca wine made it precisely the kind of product that could lead to widespread habitual use, particularly among populations, women, the elderly, those perceived as vulnerable who might not be warned about its dangers. The reality, visible in retrospect but obscure to contemporaries, was that coca wine occupied a middle ground. It was not as immediately dangerous as injecting pure cocaine, which could produce overdose and death, but it was not as benign as its respectable presentation suggested. Regular use carried real risks: cardiovascular strain from the combined effects of cocaine and alcohol, the potential for dependence and withdrawal, the possibility of escalation to more dangerous forms of cocaine use. These risks were distributed unevenly across the user population, with some people able to use coca wine moderately without apparent harm, while others developed serious problems. The commercial success of coca wine needs to be understood within the broader context of late 19th century consumer culture, a moment when mass production, advertising, and new distribution networks were transforming the relationship between manufacturers and the public. This was the era of the Second Industrial Revolution, when steam power and mechanization were giving way to electricity and chemical industries, when railroads and steamships had knitted the world into an increasingly integrated marketplace, when literacy rates were rising, and mass circulation newspapers and magazines were creating new opportunities for advertisers to reach consumers directly. The patent medicine industry, of which coca wine was a part, was a vast and largely unregulated enterprise that thrived in this environment. In the United States alone, patent medicine sales were estimated at tens of millions of dollars annually by the 1890s, a figure that represented a significant portion of consumer spending on health-related products. Traveling salesmen, often called medicine show operators, toured small towns and rural areas, setting up temporary stages and entertaining crowds with music and comedy before launching into elaborate pitches for their products. Mail-order catalogs, distributed by companies like Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward, carried pages of patent medicine advertisements alongside farm implements and household goods. Newspaper advertisements, both display ads and classified listings, promoted hundreds of different preparations. Pharmacy shelves groaned under the weight of bottles, boxes, and packages containing tonics, elixirs, cordials, and cures for every conceivable ailment. COCA wine fit perfectly into this ecosystem. It was respectable enough to be sold in pharmacies and consumed by middle-class families, yet exotic enough to carry the allure of the new and the foreign. The Andean origins of COCA were emphasized in marketing materials, often with illustrations of indigenous people harvesting leaves or of mountain landscapes, lending the product an air of ancient wisdom and natural purity. The wine component connected it to European tradition and sophistication, particularly French tradition, which in the late 19th century carried connotations of refinement and cultural superiority. The result was a product that could be positioned as both modern and timeless, scientific and natural, exotic and familiar. The economics of COCA wine production were straightforward and highly profitable for successful manufacturers. COCA leaves could be imported relatively cheaply from Peru and Bolivia, where cultivation remained robust and where local economies had adapted to serve the international pharmaceutical trade. A kilogram of dried COCA leaves, purchased in bulk from South American exporters, might cost a manufacturer $2 to $5 in the 1880s, depending on quality and market conditions. That kilogram, properly processed, could yield enough extracted alkaloids to produce 50 or more bottles of COCA wine, depending on the desired concentration. Wine, the other major ingredient, could be purchased in bulk for a few cents per bottle, particularly if the manufacturer was willing to use lower-grade wine and disguise its deficiencies with sugar and flavoring. The manufacturing process, while requiring some pharmaceutical knowledge and equipment, was not technically complex or capital-intensive. A moderately equipped pharmacy or small laboratory could produce COCA wine in batches of dozens or hundreds of bottles. The leaves were macerated in wine, often with some mechanical agitation to speed extraction, for several days or weeks. The mixture was then filtered to remove plant material, sometimes clarified with fining agents to improve appearance, and bottled. Corks, labels, and packaging added to the cost, but represented a small fraction of the total expense. The profit margins were substantial, particularly for premium brands that could command high retail prices. Mariani's Vin. Mariani sold for between $1 and $3 per bottle, depending on the market and the size of the bottle, at a time when a working-class laborer might earn $1 or $2 for a full day's work. The production cost was probably no more than 30 to 50 cents per bottle, including all ingredients, packaging, and labor, yielding profit margins of 50 to 80% before accounting for distribution and marketing costs. These margins were high enough to support extensive advertising campaigns, which Mariani pursued with remarkable sophistication and creativity. The marketing materials Mariani produced were works of art in their own right. His advertising albums, mentioned earlier, were printed on high-quality paper with elaborate typography and illustrations. Some featured chromolithography, a printing process that could reproduce color images with remarkable fidelity and that was expensive and time-consuming. These albums were not mass-distributed but were given to physicians, pharmacists, and influential individuals who could serve as opinion leaders and recommenders. The investment in these materials signaled quality and legitimacy, distinguishing Vin Mariani from cheaper competitors. Mariani also pioneered the use of what would later be called brand ambassadors. The celebrities who endorsed his product were not merely names on a list, but were incorporated into an ongoing marketing narrative. Their images appeared on posters, in newspaper advertisements, in shop window displays. Their testimonials were quoted in promotional literature and reprinted in the press. Some were invited to Mariani's laboratory and reception rooms in Paris, where they were photographed with bottles of Vin Mariani and where their visits were publicized. The cumulative effect was to create a sense that Vin Mariani was not just a product, but a cultural phenomenon, something that connected consumers to the world of art, literature, science, and power. The international reach of COCA wine was considerable and reflected the global ambitions of manufacturers like Mariani. Vin Mariani was exported to dozens of countries across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Mariani established offices and warehouses in major cities: London, New York, Rome, Madrid, Buenos Aires. He appointed local agents and distributors who were responsible for cultivating relationships with pharmacists and physicians, for managing local advertising, and for ensuring product availability. The logistics of this international operation were complex, requiring coordination of shipping schedules, management of customs procedures, translation of marketing materials into local languages, and adaptation to local regulatory environments where such regulations existed. In the United States, the market was particularly lucrative and competitive. American consumers had developed an appetite for patent medicines that surpassed even European consumption, driven by a combination of factors: a geographically dispersed population with limited access to physicians in rural areas, a cultural emphasis on self-reliance and individual initiative that extended to health management, an entrepreneurial business environment with minimal regulatory oversight, and a robust advertising industry that had learned to manipulate consumer desires through increasingly sophisticated techniques. COCA wine entered this market in the 1870s and quickly found an audience. Vin Mariani was imported and distributed through New York, with American agents handling marketing and sales. But American entrepreneurs, seeing the success of the French import, quickly moved to produce their own versions. Pemberton's French wine COCA, created by Atlanta pharmacist John Stith Pemberton, was one of many domestic products that sought to capture some of Mariani's market share while undercutting his price and adapting to American tastes and regulatory quirks. Pemberton's story is particularly instructive because it illustrates both the opportunities and the vulnerabilities of the COCA wine business in the American context. Pemberton had trained as a pharmacist and had served as a Confederate Army officer during the Civil War, during which he had been wounded and had developed a morphine dependency while treating his injuries. Like many in his generation, he struggled with addiction and sought pharmaceutical solutions to manage pain and to maintain functionality. His interest in COCA, both as a potential treatment for morphine addiction and as a commercial opportunity, led him to experiment with COCA wine formulations in the early 1880s. Pemberton's French wine COCA, introduced around 1884, was marketed with claims similar to those of Vin Mariani. It promised to cure nervous afflictions, to restore vitality, to relieve dyspepsia and mental exhaustion. His advertisements emphasized the French connection, even though the product was made in Atlanta, because French pharmaceuticals carried prestige in American markets. He distributed the product through pharmacies in Georgia and the surrounding states, and initial sales were encouraging. But Pemberton faced a challenge that Mariani in France did not: the growing strength of the temperance movement in the American South. By the mid-1880s, temperance sentiment was strong enough in Georgia that some counties had enacted local prohibition laws, banning the sale of alcoholic beverages. The presence of wine in Pemberton's product, even though it was marketed as medicine rather than beverage, created legal uncertainties and limited his potential market. Some pharmacies were reluctant to stock an alcohol-containing product. Some customers were reluctant to purchase it, and Pemberton recognized that the regulatory environment was shifting against him. His response, in 1886, was to reformulate. He removed the wine and replaced it with carbonated water and sugar syrup, creating a non-alcoholic coca-based beverage. He kept the coca extract, maintaining the stimulant effect, and added cola nut extract, another source of caffeine and flavor. He named the new product Coca-Cola, a name that preserved the connection to the original Coca wine formulation while signaling the shift to a different format. The name itself was a brilliant piece of marketing, combining the exotic appeal of Coca with the alliteration of cola, creating a memorable and distinctive brand. Coca-Cola would, of course, go on to become one of the most successful commercial products in history, though the Coca content would be removed in the early 20th century under regulatory pressure. But the origin story is important because it shows how Coca wine, facing regulatory and cultural pressures, could transform into something different while preserving some of its essential appeal. The promise of energy, refreshment, and enhancement. The temperance movement's growing influence created both opportunities and challenges for Coca wine manufacturers across the United States. On one hand, Coca wine could be marketed as a temperance beverage, a healthful alternative to hard liquor. Advertisements sometimes emphasized that Coca wine was a medicinal preparation, not an intoxicant, that it was taken in small therapeutic doses rather than consumed for drunkenness, that it represented the rational use of alcohol for health rather than the irrational pursuit of intoxication. This positioning appealed to some temperance-minded consumers who were willing to use alcohol medicinally but who rejected social drinking. On the other hand, the presence of alcohol, however modest, made many temperance advocates suspicious. Some saw Coca wine as a gateway to drink, a way for alcohol to infiltrate homes and communities under the guise of medicine. Temperance publications sometimes warned against patent medicines containing alcohol, arguing that they undermined efforts to promote total abstinence. The result was that Coca wine manufacturers had to navigate a complex and shifting cultural landscape, adapting their marketing to emphasize medical legitimacy, while defending against accusations that they were promoting vice under cover of health. The international market also included colonial territories, where European imperial powers were extending their commercial and political reach. Coca wine appeared in the pharmacies of colonial cities from Saigon to Cairo, from Cape Town to Bombay, brought by colonial physicians, administrators, and merchants. The product's positioning as a European pharmaceutical gave it prestige and legitimacy in colonial contexts, where European goods were often valued above local alternatives regardless of actual quality or appropriateness. In some colonial territories, the consumption of Coca wine by European elites existed alongside indigenous uses of coca leaves, creating a complex cultural dynamic. In Peru and Bolivia, where coca was grown and where indigenous communities had chewed the leaves for centuries, the transformation of coca into a European luxury product represented a kind of pharmaceutical colonialism. The plant's value was extracted, concentrated, and exported, with profits flowing to European manufacturers, while the source communities often remained impoverished. The irony of Europeans marketing coca as an exotic and precious substance to consumers in countries where coca grew wild was not lost on all observers, though it was rarely remarked upon in the marketing materials. As coca wine spread through parlors and pharmacies, a parallel conversation was developing about the ethics and dangers of stimulation itself. The late 19th century was a period of intense anxiety about nervous exhaustion, about the pace of modern life, about the physical and mental toll of industrial capitalism. Physicians diagnosed neurasthenia, a vague condition characterized by fatigue, irritability, and lack of vitality, with increasing frequency. The diagnosis was applied broadly to businessmen overworked in offices, to women exhausted by domestic labor and childbearing, to intellectuals worn down by mental exertion. Coca wine, along with other tonics and stimulants, was marketed as a solution to this modern malaise. The advertisements spoke directly to these anxieties, promising to restore depleted energies, to fortify weakened nerves, to provide the vigor necessary for the demands of contemporary life. In this sense, coca wine was not merely a product but a response to social conditions, an attempt to pharmacologically manage the stresses of modernity. Yet even as coca wine enjoyed commercial success, critics began to voice concerns. Temperance advocates, though they sometimes grudgingly accepted medicated wines as less objectionable than distilled spirits, worried about the normalization of alcohol consumption under the guise of health. Physicians, particularly as reports of cocaine addiction and toxicity accumulated in medical literature, began to question the wisdom of making such a powerful stimulant so widely available. Moralists fretted about the implications of a society that increasingly relied on chemical aids to manage everyday life. These concerns were not merely abstract. By the 1890s, case reports of cocaine addiction were appearing with regularity in medical journals. Some of these involved medical use, physicians who had been introduced to cocaine as an anesthetic and had begun using it recreationally. Others involved patients who had started with therapeutic doses of coca wine or cocaine-containing tonics and had escalated their use. The pattern was becoming familiar. Initial relief and pleasure, followed by tolerance, increased dosing, and eventually dependency marked by withdrawal symptoms, compulsive use, and deteriorating health. The medical establishment's response was gradual and uneven. Some physicians called for stricter regulation of cocaine and coca preparations. Others argued that the problem was not the substance itself, but its misuse, and that properly supervised medical application remained valuable. The pharmaceutical industry, naturally, resisted calls for restriction, arguing that coca wine and related products were safe when used as directed, and that the benefits outweighed the risks. By the turn of the 20th century, the scientific understanding of cocaine had advanced considerably. Researchers had mapped its chemical structure, studied its effects on animal models, and begun to trace the physiological mechanisms of its action. The journal literature contained detailed accounts of cocaine's cardiovascular effects, its impact on the central nervous system, and the clinical presentations of acute toxicity and chronic use. What emerged from this research was a more nuanced and troubling picture than early enthusiasts like Freud had imagined. Cocaine was indeed an effective local anesthetic, and it had legitimate medical applications, but it was also a substance with significant abuse potential, capable of producing powerful psychological dependence and serious physical harms. The cardiovascular risks, heart arrhythmias, elevated blood pressure, risk of stroke and heart attack, were documented in case series and autopsy studies. For coca wine, this evolving scientific consensus posed a problem. The product contained cocaine, albeit in diluted form, and the medical evidence increasingly suggested that even moderate use carried risks. Moreover, the lack of standardization in the patent medicine industry meant that consumers had no reliable way to know how much cocaine they were actually consuming. Different brands contained different concentrations. Even within a single brand, batch-to-batch variation could be substantial. Efforts to regulate the patent medicine industry gained momentum in the early 1900s. In the United States, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 represented a watershed moment. The law required that medicines containing certain substances, including alcohol and cocaine, clearly label their contents. It did not ban these substances outright, but it ended the era of undisclosed ingredients and unsubstantiated claims. Manufacturers of coca wine now had to list cocaine on their labels, and consumers could make more informed choices. The impact of this transparency was immediate and significant. Many consumers, once they understood what they were drinking, chose to stop. The mystique of coca wine, its reputation as a harmless tonic, could not survive the cold clarity of ingredient lists. Sales began to decline, and manufacturers faced a choice: reformulate their products to remove cocaine or accept a shrinking market. In Europe, similar regulatory pressures were building. France, the home of Vin Mariani, began to tighten controls on cocaine-containing preparations. The International Opium Convention, held at The Hague in 1912, extended international drug control frameworks to include cocaine, recognizing it as a substance that required regulation to prevent abuse and trafficking. National governments, responding to this international consensus and to domestic public health concerns, enacted laws that restricted the manufacture, sale, and use of cocaine and coca preparations. The decline of coca wine was not a sudden collapse but a gradual retreat. Through the 1910s and into the 1920s, the product became increasingly marginal. Some manufacturers reformulated, removing the cocaine and keeping only the coca flavoring or abandoning coca altogether. Others simply ceased production. Vin Mariani, which had once enjoyed international fame, saw its sales dwindle. Angelo Mariani died in 1914, and his company struggled to adapt to the new regulatory environment. The nail in the coffin came with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 in the United States, which imposed strict controls on the distribution of cocaine and opiates. While the law was framed as a tax measure, its effect was to criminalize most non-medical use of these substances. Coca wine, which had occupied an ambiguous space between medicine and beverage, could no longer be sold legally except under tightly controlled conditions that made commercial viability impossible. By the 1920s, coca wine had largely disappeared from the market. What remained were memories and artifacts. Old bottles in attics, advertisements in vintage magazines, references in literature and memoirs. The product that had once symbolized modernity and sophistication had become a historical curiosity, a reminder of an era when the boundaries between medicine and recreation, between tonic and intoxicant, had been drawn very differently. The reasons for coca wine's disappearance were multiple and reinforcing. Scientific research had demonstrated real risks. Regulatory frameworks had evolved to restrict access. Public attitudes had shifted as awareness of addiction and cocaine's dangers grew. And perhaps most importantly, the social and economic conditions that had made coca wine appealing, the anxieties about neurasthenia, the faith in pharmaceutical solutions, the prestige of French imports had themselves changed. The disappearance of coca wine left a gap that other products would fill. Energy drinks, vitamin supplements, over-the-counter stimulants, all would later promise similar benefits: increased vitality, improved performance, relief from fatigue. The specific formulation changed, but the underlying desire for a product that could chemically manage the demands of modern life remained constant. What is striking when you examine the archival traces of coca wine is how thoroughly it was integrated into respectable society before its fall. This was not a marginal vice or an underground indulgence. It was sold in the finest pharmacies, consumed in the best homes, endorsed by popes and poets. The cultural position of coca wine offers a useful corrective to simplistic narratives about drugs and society. Substances do not carry inherent moral status. Their meanings are made through social processes, through medical claims and regulatory decisions, through marketing and moral panic, through personal experiences and collective anxieties. Coca wine could be respectable medicine in 1880 and dangerous narcotic by 1920, not because the substance changed but because the social world around it did. Literature preserves some of this cultural memory. Jules Verne reportedly used Vin Mariani and mentioned stimulant tonics in his work. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes famously used cocaine, though in the form of injections rather than wine. These literary references, filtered through fiction, capture something of the period's casual acceptance of cocaine as a tool for enhancing performance or managing boredom. Medical journals from the period offer another window. The pages are filled with earnest discussions of coca wine's therapeutic applications, debates about dosing, case reports of successful treatments, and unfortunate dependencies. Reading these journals now, one is struck by the confidence with which physicians prescribed powerful psychoactive substances with minimal understanding of their long-term effects. It was a confidence born of pharmacological optimism. the belief that chemistry could solve the problems of the human condition. Advertising materials, particularly those for Vin Mariani, represent perhaps the richest archive. Mariani's marketing team produced elaborate albums of celebrity endorsements, beautifully illustrated pamphlets, posters that combined Art Nouveau aesthetics with medical claims. These materials were carefully designed to appeal to aspirational middle-class consumers, to position the product as both scientifically advanced and culturally refined. The testimonials themselves, whether genuine or manufactured, tell us something about what users valued in COCA wine. They spoke of increased energy for work, relief from melancholy, improved digestion, better sleep despite the stimulant content, which suggests complex placebo effects, and perhaps the sedating influence of alcohol. They framed their use not as recreational indulgence, but as responsible self-care, as prudent management of their health and productivity. While COCA wine was rising and falling in European and American markets, the coca plant itself continued its older existence in the Andes. Indigenous communities never stopped chewing coca leaves, though their practices were increasingly viewed with suspicion by colonial and post-colonial authorities. The boom in cocaine production and the subsequent international controls had complex effects on these communities. On one hand, coca cultivation became more profitable as demand for the leaf increased. Farmers in Peru and Bolivia found new markets, though the profits were unevenly distributed and often extracted by middlemen. On the other hand, the criminalization of cocaine and growing international pressure to restrict coca cultivation threatened traditional uses. The 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, a UN treaty that established the modern framework of drug control, initially sought to eliminate coca chewing entirely, viewing it as a form of drug abuse rather than a cultural practice. This tension between traditional use and international drug control continues today. Bolivia and Peru have worked to distinguish between coca, the leaf used in traditional and legal contexts, and cocaine, the extracted alkaloid subject to international prohibition. The leaf remains legal and culturally important in these countries, used in teas, in ritual contexts, and as a mild stimulant. But the association with cocaine, forged in part through the history of coca wine and the subsequent cocaine trade, continues to complicate these efforts. The irony is considerable. A plant that had been used safely and sustainably for thousands of years became, through the processes of extraction, commercialization, and eventual prohibition, a symbol of danger and abuse. The story of coca wine is thus not just a story about a defunct beverage, but about the costs of pharmaceutical imperialism, about what happens when traditional botanical knowledge is appropriated, concentrated, marketed, and then criminalized. What can we learn from the rise and fall of coca wine? Several lessons suggest themselves, though history rarely provides simple morals. First, the regulatory environment matters profoundly. Coca wine flourished in an era of minimal oversight, when manufacturers could make any claim and include any ingredient without disclosure or testing. The Pure Food and Drug Act and subsequent regulations did not eliminate all harms, but they introduced transparency and accountability that shifted market dynamics. Modern debates about supplement regulation, about energy drinks, about the appropriate level of government oversight for psychoactive substances echo these earlier struggles. Second, scientific knowledge evolves, and medical consensus can shift dramatically. What seemed safe and beneficial in one era can be recognized as dangerous in another. This is not simply a matter of more research revealing hidden truths. It is also about changing frameworks of understanding, about what questions scientists ask and how they interpret answers. The late 19th century's faith in pharmaceutical solutions to social problems looks naive from our vantage point, but our own age has its own pharmacological enthusiasms that future generations may view with similar skepticism. Third, the line between medicine and recreation is culturally constructed and historically contingent. Coca wine was marketed as medicine, used as a tonic, and experienced as a mild intoxicant. These categories overlapped in ways that made classification difficult. Current debates about medical marijuana, about microdosing psychedelics, about the therapeutic use of MDMA, all grapple with similar categorical ambiguities. The history of Coca wine suggests that these boundaries are negotiated through medical research, regulatory decision-making, and social practice rather than discovered as natural facts. Fourth, marketing and celebrity endorsement shape consumption patterns powerfully. Angelo Mariani understood that associating his product with famous, respected figures would confer legitimacy and desirability. This strategy, now commonplace in advertising, was innovative in its time. The lesson is not that celebrity endorsement is inherently problematic, but that it can obscure risks and create demand that outpaces scientific understanding. Fifth, social inequality shapes both the patterns of use and the consequences of regulation. Coca wine was primarily a product for the middle and upper classes, while cocaine, in other forms, particularly after the decline of Coca wine, became associated with working-class and marginalized communities. Enforcement of cocaine laws in the early 20th century, like later drug enforcement, disproportionately targeted these communities. The history reminds us that drug policy is never merely about pharmacology, but always also about power, about who is permitted to use which substances under what conditions. The last bottles of genuine Vin Mariani, sealed with Angelo Mariani's proprietary blend of Bordeaux and Coca, are collector's items now, sold at auction when they surface, displayed in museums of pharmaceutical history. The liquid inside, if any remains, would be undrinkable. The wine turned to vinegar, the cocaine degraded, but the bottles themselves, with their ornate labels and elaborate typography, carry a ghostly presence, a reminder of a world that believed chemistry could perfect the human condition without cost. Coca wine is gone, but the desire it satisfied, for energy, for mood enhancement, for chemical assistance in navigating modern life, persists and proliferates. We have replaced it with other products. Caffeine delivered in countless forms, prescription stimulants, supplements promising focus and vitality, energy drinks marketed with the same promises Mariani once made. The substances change, the regulations evolve, but the fundamental transaction, chemical molecules exchanged for altered experience, remains. If you visit the Musée de l'Assistance Publique in Paris, you can see some of Mariani's advertising materials, preserved under glass. The testimonials from Pope Leo XIII, from Sarah Bernhardt, from dozens of others, still make their claims. Vigor restored, nerves calmed, life improved. Looking at these documents now, knowing what we know about cocaine, about addiction, about the ultimate fate of the product, one might feel superiority, the comfortable certainty that we are wiser than our ancestors. But that superiority is misplaced. Every era has its blind spots, its substances it considers safe until proven otherwise, its products marketed with claims that later generations will find credulous. The history of Coca wine is not a simple story of ignorance corrected by knowledge. It is a more complicated narrative about how societies negotiate risk, how they balance individual liberty and public health, how they decide which pleasures are permissible and which must be prohibited. The coca plant still grows in the Andes, still chewed by those who cultivate it, still processed illegally into cocaine for global markets, still caught between tradition and prohibition. The wine industry continues, producing beverages fortified with herbs and claimed to have various health benefits, though none now contain cocaine. And in laboratories, researchers continue to study stimulants, to measure their effects, to search for therapeutic applications while managing risks of abuse. The story of coca wine, then, is not finished. It is a chapter in a much longer history, one that continues to unfold in legislative chambers and research labs, in clinics and courtrooms, in the choices individuals make about what to put into their bodies and the choices societies make about which of those choices to permit, the leaf and the glass, the extraction and the regulation, the pleasure and the price, all remain with us in different forms. In the quiet of an archive, with the light slanting through old windows onto older documents, one can almost hear the clink of glasses from a century past, can almost smell the wine and taste the bitter alkaloid beneath the sweetness. It is a haunting, not of ghosts but of choices, of paths taken and not taken, of the persistent human desire to transcend limitation through chemistry, and the equally persistent reality that every transcendence carries its costs. Consider the evidence. Consider what we drink and why, what we prohibit and on what grounds. The past pours itself into the present in ways we rarely notice until we stop to look carefully at what we're holding in our hands. Good night.